The day Sarah Wells stood up in the Millhaven town hall and raised her hand against every single soul in that room was the day Eli Granger decided she was the most remarkable woman he had ever laid eyes on. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Kansas plains had turned the color of old copper, the grasses bending low under a wind that carried the first cold bite of the season. Millhaven was not a large town, but it was a proud one, settled along the banks of the Cimarron River by families who had scratched their lives out of hard soil and harder weather. The town hall was the largest building in Millhaven, a structure of rough-hewn timber and wide plank floors that smelled perpetually of sawdust and boot leather. On the evening of September the 14th, every chair inside that building was occupied, and men stood 3 deep along the walls, and women sat in the back rows with their hands folded in their laps and their opinions held carefully behind their teeth, because that was simply how things were done in Millhaven in the year 1878. The matter before the town that evening was the appointment of Eli Granger as the new head of the Millhaven Cattlemen's Association, the organization that controlled the water rights along the northern stretch of the Cimarron, negotiated with the railroad men who came through twice a year, and effectively decided which ranchers prospered and which ones did not. It was a position of considerable power, and Eli Granger had earned his shot at it through 7 years of honest ranching, fair dealing with his neighbors, and a reputation for keeping his word that stretched all the way to Dodge City. Eli himself sat at the front of the room in a straight-backed chair, his hat balanced on his knee, his dark hair pressed flat from wearing it all day. He was 32 years old, lean and weathered in the way that working men became weathered on the Kansas plains, with crow's feet already deepening at the corners of his gray eyes and hands that were calloused and capable. He was not a vain man and had never thought much about his own appearance, but he had pressed his good shirt that evening and run a razor over his jaw, because he understood that this meeting mattered, and he wanted to show respect to the people being asked to trust him. Mayor Aldous Finch stood at the front of the room and read through Eli's qualifications in the toneless way of a man who considers formality a necessary inconvenience. There were nods throughout the crowd. Old Fletcher Hanby, who owned the largest spread outside of town, had already told 3 people that morning that Eli Granger was the only sensible choice. The barber, Pete Calloway, had spread the same word to every man whose ears he had trimmed that week. By the time Mayor Finch finished reading and asked whether anyone objected to the appointment before the vote was called, the outcome felt as certain as sunrise. Sarah Wells raised her hand. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when something occurs that a room full of people had not considered possible. Sarah was 26 years old, and she had been in Millhaven for 14 months, having arrived from Springfield, Missouri, following the death of her father, to take over the small parcel of land he had purchased but never lived to develop. She was not unknown in town. She ran a small vegetable operation and sold her produce at the weekend market, and she was considered pleasant and capable by those who had any dealings with her. But she was a single woman without family connections in Millhaven, and she had not, to anyone's recollection, ever spoken at a town meeting before. Mayor Finch looked at her over his spectacles. "Miss Wells, you have an objection." "I do," she said, and her voice was clear and did not waver, though the color in her cheeks ran high. She stood up, and Eli noticed that she did not fidget or look away from the mayor, which took more nerve than most people in that room would have had. "I am not objecting to Mr. Granger's character, which I understand to be good. I am objecting to the structure of the appointment itself. The Cattlemen's Association controls the water allocation for this entire northern stretch, including the rights that affect smaller farming operations like my own. But there is no provision in the association's charter for any representation of agricultural interests beyond cattle. If we appoint a head of this association, without first amending that charter, we are essentially voting to continue a system that leaves farming families without any voice in decisions that directly affect their survival. The room stirred. Fletcher Hanby made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word. Pete Calloway looked at the man beside him with an expression of faint amusement, as though Sarah had said something entertainingly naive. Mayor Finch cleared his throat and said that this was a fine point, but perhaps not the appropriate venue for a broader discussion of the association structure. Then I would like to formally request that, before we proceed to a vote, we schedule such a discussion, Sarah said, and I would like my objection entered into the record of this meeting. Miss Wells, Fletcher Hanby said from his seat near the front, not bothering to stand, which was itself a kind of dismissal, the association has operated this way for 12 years without issue. It has operated this way for 12 years without anyone raising an issue, Sarah said, which is not the same thing. The vote proceeded after that, because the vote was always going to proceed, and the outcome was what everyone had expected. Every hand in the room went up for Eli Granger's appointment. Every hand except one, which belonged to Sarah Wells, who did not raise it in opposition so much as simply declined to raise it in favor, sitting with her hands folded on the table before her, while the room registered its displeasure through the subtle language of turned shoulders and meaningful looks. Eli Granger watched the whole thing from his chair at the front. He watched Sarah Wells stand and make her argument and not break under the weight of the room's collective impatience. He watched her sit back down when she was finished and fold her hands and hold her chin at a perfectly level angle while people around her whispered. He watched her after the vote, when she gathered her things quietly and walked toward the door, and he noticed that she did not hurry and she did not look ashamed. When the meeting broke up and people filed out into the cool September night, Eli found himself standing on the wooden steps of the town hall, watching the lantern lights spilling out across the packed dirt of Main Street, and he was thinking about what Sarah Wells had said. Not the way it had been delivered, though that had been impressive enough. The substance of it. She had been right. The charter made no accommodation for agricultural interests, and the water allocations that the association controlled did affect every small farmer along the northern Cimarron. It was not a thing he had thought about because he had always approached the cattlemen's world from inside it, and from inside it the arrangements seemed natural and inevitable. But from outside it they probably looked quite different. He saw her walking down the street toward where a small bay horse was tied at the rail outside Dunmore's general store, and he made a decision that surprised him slightly. He caught up to her in a dozen long strides. "Miss Wells." She turned, and there was a wariness in her expression that he suspected she had learned from experience rather than temperament. She was a woman of medium height with dark brown hair pinned carefully under a plain bonnet and eyes that were an unusual shade somewhere between green and gray, which he registered and then set aside as irrelevant. She looked at him the way someone looks when they expect to be told, in polite but firm terms, that they have overstepped. "I want you to know," he said, "that I think you made a fair point tonight." She studied him for a moment. "You are the man who just received the appointment." "I am." "Then it seems somewhat convenient for you to say so now." He smiled at that which he had not entirely expected to do. "It might be, but I mean it regardless." He settled his hat back on his head. "The charter question you raised is legitimate. I'm going to look into it." She tilted her head slightly, still assessing him with those gray-green eyes. "And if looking into it reveals that the charter ought to be amended, then I will advocate for amending it," he said. "That is the honest answer." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the impression she was measuring the distance between his words and some likelihood of truth that she was calculating privately. "That is a generous thing to say, Mr. Granger." "Eli," he said. "My name is Eli." "Miss Wells," she said, which was not exactly a reciprocal offer, but he did not miss the slight upward turn at one corner of her mouth as she said it. She untied her horse and rode home under a sky thick with stars, and Eli stood on the street watching her go, and felt something that he did not have a ready name for, something that settled into his chest quietly, and with more permanence than he would have anticipated from a 5-minute conversation with a woman he had barely known existed an hour ago. The weeks that followed were busy for Eli in the way that the head of a cattlemen's association's early tenure was always busy. There were accounts to review and water allocation records to go over and two disputes between neighboring ranchers to mediate before things escalated to something uglier. He wrote a great deal and slept less than he should have and ate most of his meals standing up in the kitchen of his ranch house, which was comfortable if not elaborate, a solid four-room structure he had built himself over 3 seasons. But he made the time, on a Wednesday 2 weeks after the town meeting, to ride to the county seat and pull the Millhaven Cattlemen's Association charter from the records office. He read it in its entirety, sitting at a table in the records room with the afternoon light coming through a single high window. Sarah Wells had been exactly right. There was no provision for agricultural representation, and furthermore, there were several passages that, when read carefully, gave the association nearly unchecked authority over water allocation decisions that affected every property along a 12-mile stretch of the Cimarron. It was not that anyone had designed it as an instrument of injustice, or at least he did not think so. It was simply that it had been written by cattlemen for a world they understood, and that world had not included people like Sarah Wells. He wrote up his findings in a letter to the association's 3 senior members and proposed a meeting to discuss charter revision. Fletcher Hamby wrote back within the week, his response short and unenthusiastic. The other 2 members were more measured in their responses, neither supporting nor opposing, which Eli read as a kind of cautious willingness to be persuaded. The following Saturday was market day in Millhaven, and Eli came to town for supplies, which he did most Saturdays, and found himself stopping at the small vegetable stand near the corner of the market square. He told himself that his route simply took him past it, which was largely true. Sarah was behind the table, her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the October chill, arranging late-season squash and turnips and the last of the season's dried herbs in neat rows. She looked up when his shadow fell across the table and did not appear entirely surprised to see him, though her expression was measured. "Mr. Granger," she said. "I looked at the charter," he said, bypassing pleasantries because he sensed she would respect that more. Her hand stilled over a bundle of dried sage. "And you were right. The language gives the association more authority than most people probably realize. I have proposed a review meeting to the senior members." She was quiet for a moment, and something moved across her face that he might have called relief if he had known her better, though she kept it carefully controlled. "What was the reception?" "Mixed," he said honestly. "Fletcher Hamby is against it. The others are undecided. I expect it will take some persuading." "It usually does," she said, and the weariness in those 3 words carried a weight that told him she had done a fair amount of persuading in her life, not always successfully. "May I ask you something?" He said. She gave a slight nod. "Why did you come to Millhaven? If you expected to farm here, you must have known it would not be easy." She looked at him steadily for a moment, as though deciding whether the question was intrusive or genuine. "My father bought the land when I was 12, she said. "He always meant to come out here, but his health never allowed it, and then he passed 2 winters ago. The land was the main thing he left me. I could have sold it, but it felt like selling the last thing he had hoped for." She paused. "So I came instead." It was a straightforward answer, and it was also one that told him quite a lot about who she was. "How old were you when you came?" he asked. 25. Old enough to know better, some people said. There was a dry amusement in it that he liked. "Some people say that about most things worth doing," he said. She looked at him then directly, and he had the experience of feeling genuinely seen, which was not common, and he held it without flinching. "You could have simply received your appointment and not worried further about anything I said," she told him. "I could have," he agreed. "So why did you?" He considered how to answer that honestly without sounding as though he was performing honesty, which was its own kind of dishonesty. "Because you were right," he said. and I would rather know that I am operating within a fair system than an unfair one, even if the unfair one benefits me." She held his gaze for another moment, then turned back to her squash and rearranged a row of them that did not need rearranging. "I will be at the market next Saturday as well," she said, which was not quite an invitation but was not one either. "I do my supply run most Saturdays," he said, which was not quite an acceptance but landed in the same place. He bought 2 turnips he did not particularly need and walked back to his horse feeling unreasonably pleased with himself. October deepened and the plains took on that particular quality of vast, cold beauty that Kansas did better than anywhere Eli had ever been, the sky going enormous and pale at the edges and the grasses silver-gray against it. He and Sarah developed a habit, slowly and without ever formally deciding to, of talking at the market on Saturdays. The conversations began as continuations of the charter question, which was substantive and gave them both a useful framework within which to operate, but they drifted, as conversations between people who are beginning to be interested in each other will drift, into adjacent territories. He learned that she had gone to a good school in Springfield and read more widely than most people he knew, and that she had strong opinions about novels that she had never previously had occasion to share, because nobody in her life had particularly wanted to hear them. He told her about the 7 years he had spent building his cattle operation up from a $20 stake and a borrowed horse, about the first 2 winters when he had been genuinely uncertain whether he would make it, about the strange pride he had felt the first time he drove his own herd to market. She told him about the first season on her land, when she had underestimated the soil composition and lost half her vegetable crop by October. She had, she said, sat down in the dirt between the ruined rows and cried for exactly 20 minutes, which she had timed on her father's pocket watch, and then she had stood up and started planning how to do better the following year. 20 minutes, he said. "I believe in allowing grief its full proper space," she said. "But I do not believe in letting it expand beyond what is necessary." He thought about that for a long time after. It struck him as one of the more sensible philosophies he had encountered. The charter revision meeting happened in mid-November, and it was contentious in the particular way that meetings between men who stand to lose something always are. Fletcher Hamby brought his son-in-law, who was a lawyer of sorts, and had a habit of finding the worst possible interpretation of any proposed change. Eli had prepared carefully, spending 3 evenings working through the specific language of the revisions he was proposing, which were modest in scope but meaningful in principle. He was not asking for agricultural representatives to have voting authority over cattle matters. He was asking for a formal advisory role for farming interests in any decision that affected water allocation, with that advisory input to be recorded and considered before any allocation was changed. Hamby called it the first step toward the association being run by dirt farmers, which was meant as an insult, and which Eli noted without responding to it directly. "The water in the Cimarron does not belong to the Cattlemen's Association," Eli said. "It belongs to this county, and everyone in this county has a legitimate interest in how it is allocated. We are asking for the right to make decisions without being obliged to hear from the people those decisions affect. I am not willing to operate that way." The vote among the senior members ended in a 2-to-1 decision in Eli's favor, with Hanby dissenting. The charter revision was approved for the following month's general membership meeting, where it passed by a narrower margin than Eli would have liked, but passed nonetheless. He told Sarah about it the following Saturday, and she went so still that he thought for a moment something was wrong, and then he realized that she was simply absorbing the information without her usual careful composure getting in the way. There was something open in her face for just a moment, something that looked very much like the kind of relief that a person only feels when they have been holding tension for a long time and are finally permitted to put it down. "They actually amended it," she said. "They did. It is not everything it ought to be, but it is a starting point." She looked at him then, and there was something in her eyes that was different from her usual measured appraisal, something warmer and less defended. "Thank you," she said. "That is not a small thing." "No," he agreed, "it is not." They stood there in the cold November morning with their breath making small clouds between them, and he was deeply aware of her, of the particular quality of her attention and the steadiness of her, and he recognized with full clarity that what he had been feeling since September had organized itself into something definite and real. He was not a man who confused himself about his own emotions. He was in love with Sarah Wells, or the nearest thing to it that 7 weeks of Saturday conversations and a shared interest in doing what was right could produce, which he suspected was already closer than most people got. He did not say anything about it that day, because he understood that she had arrived in Millhaven alone and built something for herself through enormous effort and discipline, and a woman who had done that did not need to be rushed toward anything. She would get there in her own time or she would not, and he would wait either way and count himself fortunate for the friendship in the meantime. December arrived in a cold rush, and the Cimarron frosted over at the edges, and the cattle on Eli's spread needed more tending. He was busy in the way that December on a working ranch always made a man busy, but he made his Saturday runs to town without fail. Sarah's market stand had shifted to dried goods and preserved items, the growing season long over, and she had begun trading in small handmade items, tin goods and dried herb bundles, and preserves she had put up in the summer, which sold steadily because she had an eye for quality and priced things fairly. One Saturday in early December he arrived at the market to find her stand unattended, which was unusual enough that he felt a small cold thing shift in his chest. He asked Clara Dunmore, who had the adjacent stand, and Clara said that Sarah had gone to fetch more jars from her wagon and had been gone a bit longer than expected. He found her around the corner of the livery stable, her small wagon with the bay horse hitched to it, and she was kneeling in the dirt beside the wagon's rear wheel with her sleeves up again and a wrench in her hand, working at a wheel nut that was clearly giving her trouble. The wheel was listing at a visible angle, and it occurred to him that she had probably driven into town with it like that, which was both impressive and alarming. "The nut is stripped," she said without looking up because she heard his boots and apparently knew them already, which pleased him more than he let show. "Let me look at it," he said. "I can manage." "I know you can," he said, crouching down beside her. "I am here and I know wheel hardware, so let me look." She sat back and gave him room, which he suspected cost her something, and he examined the wheel. The nut was indeed stripped, but not beyond recovery if you approached it from the right angle, which required a specific grip that he demonstrated, and the nut broke free after 2 hard turns. He got the wheel properly seated and tightened while she held the lamp she had retrieved from the wagon. "You should not have driven in on that," he said. "I was aware of the risk," she said. "I did not have another option." He stood up and dusted his hands on his thighs. "I could look at your equipment before the next season. Make sure everything is in order." She looked at him with that measuring look. "That is the second time you have inserted yourself into a problem of mine. And the second time you have let me," he said. The corner of her mouth did the thing it sometimes did. "So it is." They walked back to her stand together, and he helped her carry the jars of preserves she had come for, and they talked for the better part of an hour while the December wind cut across the market square and drove most people inside. He did not notice the cold in any particular way, which was new information about himself. Christmas came to Millhaven in the form of a church social and a community dinner in the town hall, which was decorated with pine boughs and candles, and smelled considerably better than it had during the September meeting. Eli came, because the social was expected of him in his new role, and found himself watching the door longer than was sensible before Sarah arrived with Clara Dunmore, who had apparently adopted her as a friend sometime in the autumn. She wore a dark green dress that he had not seen before, which was simple in cut but good in color, and she had done something different with her hair, though he could not have said exactly what, only that it made the line of her jaw more visible, and the whole effect was something he had to make a deliberate effort not to stare at. He asked her to dance, because there was a fiddle player and a caller, and the dancing was part of the evening's program, and it would not have been strange to ask. She agreed with a composure that might have been entirely genuine or might have been covering something else, and he was not sure which, and the uncertainty was itself a kind of pleasure. She was a good dancer, precise and light, which did not surprise him. He was adequate, which he knew, and he told her so preemptively so she would not feel obligated to lie about it. "You are better than you claim," she said after the first reel. "And you dance like you have strong opinions about it," he said. "I do," she said, with absolute seriousness, and then laughed, which was the first time he had heard her laugh without any restraint around it, open and warm and brief, and he filed it away alongside everything else he was collecting about her. They danced 3 dances and then stepped outside onto the hall's porch, because the room had grown close with the heat of all those people and the candles, and stood in the cold, clear night looking at the stars over the Kansas plains. The Milky Way was extravagant above them, the way it only was in places with no competing light. "My father used to say that the stars looked like that when God had been particularly generous that day," Sarah said, tipping her head back. "What did he mean by generous?" "I am not sure. I always thought he meant something like, all the things that happened today were worth having happened." She paused. It was a good-natured way of looking at things. "He sounds like he was someone worth knowing," Eli said. "He was," she said simply, and there was the small shadow of grief in it that she did not hide, just held cleanly in the way she apparently held everything. He turned to look at her profile against the dark and the stars, and he was very aware that if he were going to say something, this was the kind of moment that called for it. He was not a man who let moments pass and then wondered afterward, so he said, "Sarah." She turned to look at him, and whatever she saw in his face, it did not make her step away. "I want to be clear about something," he said, "because I think you deserve clarity and not maneuvering." "I would prefer clarity," she said, her voice steady. "I have very much enjoyed getting to know you these past months," he said, "and my interest in you is not the kind that is satisfied by Saturday conversations, though I have valued those more than I can easily say. I would like to know you better in whatever way you are comfortable with, and I would like you to know that is my intention." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the fiddle inside started up again, and they could hear the caller's voice and the thump of boots on the floor through the wall. "You are a direct man," she said finally. "When it matters," he said. "I appreciate directness," she said. "And I will be direct in return. I am not a woman who makes decisions quickly about things that matter. I have learned that caution is usually correct." She paused. "But I would like to know you better as well, and I think I have been finding reasons to be at the market earlier on Saturdays." He smiled at that. "I ride slower past your stand than I need to." "I noticed," she said. They stood there for another few minutes, not touching but with everything between them slightly different from how it had been, and then the cold finally drove them back inside, and Eli thought that the night had been very well worth attending. January on the Kansas plains was a serious business, and the winter of 1879 was a cold one, the Cimarron frozen solid from bank to bank, and the wind coming down from the north with a purpose that bent even the tough prairie grasses. Eli spent most of his days with his herd, supplementing their feed and watching for any sign of illness in the stock, because a bad winter could turn a cattle operation quickly if you were not attentive. He managed, despite the weather and the work, to make it to town on Saturday mornings, though Sarah's market stand was closed in January because there was simply nothing to sell at that time of year, and because standing outside in that cold for 3 hours served no useful purpose. Instead, he had found that he could stop at Clara Dunmore's house, where Sarah took her Saturdays during winter, and where Clara's husband and her youngest son were always somewhere underfoot, which made it a perfectly appropriate place for a man to call. He and Sarah talked in Clara's front parlor with cups of coffee that Clara kept well supplied, and occasionally Clara herself sat with them, and occasionally she had things to attend to in other parts of the house. And as the winter progressed, these visits grew longer and the coffee went cold while they talked about everything and nothing and the particular world they were both building out on the Kansas plains. He told her one afternoon in late January, when the wind outside was extraordinary and the window glass was beaded with ice on the inside edge, about his own family, which had been scattered by the war when he was a boy. His father had not come back from Virginia, which had left his mother with 3 boys and a farm in Ohio that she had managed with fierce intelligence until Eli was old enough to help. He had come west at 22 with the intention of making something large enough that his family's sacrifice felt like it had been directed at something worth the cost. Sarah listened with the full attention she brought to everything, and when he finished, she said, "Did it work? Did it become large enough?" "It is getting there," he said. "Some days it feels like it might. What would it look like when it is large enough?" He considered that. "A house that can hold more than one person without feeling lonely," he said, and then looked at the table, because he had not entirely meant to say it out loud. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My father always said that a house becomes a home when it knows more than one person's footsteps." He looked up at her, and she was looking at him, and something that had been building carefully for 4 months was very close to the surface of both of them. It was February when he first kissed her, on a Saturday afternoon when he had come to Clara's, and Clara, perhaps not entirely by accident, had found that she needed to speak to her husband about something urgently, and had left them alone in the parlor with the fire and the wind, and a silence that had grown very warm. He had not planned it as such, but he reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand palm up and held his, and he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers very gently, a question rather than a statement, and she answered it by not pulling away and by pressing back the smallest fraction. When they separated, she looked at him with those gray-green eyes and said, "I have been wondering when that was going to happen." "And," he said. "And it was worth wondering about," she said, which was the best possible answer. Spring came to Millhaven like an exhalation, the plains turning green from one week to the next with the particular extravagance that the plains allowed themselves in April, wildflowers appearing in the grasses and the Cimarron running high and fast with snowmelt. Sarah's land woke up along with everything else, and she was suddenly enormously busy, preparing her beds and consulting the almanac she had annotated heavily in the margins with her own observations from the previous 2 seasons. Eli helped when he could spare the time, which was not as often as he would have liked because spring was also a serious time for cattle operations. But he came 2 evenings a week and on Sunday afternoons, and they worked alongside each other in the particular comfortable silence of people who have found that they do not need to fill every moment with words. Her land was adjacent to the northern edge of the area affected by the Cimarron water allocation, and with the amended charter now in effect, she had participated in the spring allocation meeting for the first time. It had been, she told him, a somewhat uncomfortable experience, as she was the only agricultural representative in a room full of cattlemen who were polite to her face and skeptical behind their expressions. "Fletcher Hanby," she said, pulling a weed from between her bean rows with a decisive motion, looked at me the entire meeting as if I were a footnote that had somehow gotten loose from its page. Eli sat back on his heels and laughed. "That is an accurate description of how Fletcher looks at most things he disagrees with. I made my case for an adequate allocation for the spring planting season," she said, "and it was noted in the record, which is what the charter now requires. Whether it affects the actual decision remains to be seen." "It will," he said. "I will make sure of it." She looked at him. "I know you will," she said, and the simple certainty in it, the unguarded trust, was something he felt in a way that was hard to locate precisely but sat somewhere near his sternum. The spring allocation did reflect the agricultural input, modestly but measurably, and Sarah's operation had a better season for it. By June her beds were producing well, and she had expanded to include a small section of sunflowers, which she grew for the seeds and the oil. Eli had told her in February that he thought sunflowers were impractical, and she had told him that practicality was not the only organizing principle of a life, and she had been right, because by July the sunflower section was a gold and black spectacle that people drove a quarter-mile out of their way to look at. He proposed to her on an evening in July, standing at the edge of the sunflower field in the last light, which was the kind of light that makes the whole Kansas sky look as though it is lit from somewhere behind. He had thought about it for weeks, not because he doubted himself but because he wanted to get it right, and he had decided that the right approach was the same one that had served him at the beginning, which was directness without calculation. "Sarah," he said, and she was looking at the sunflowers, so she turned to look at him, "I want to marry you. Not because it is the sensible next step or because it is what is expected, but because I cannot imagine a future that does not have you in it, and I do not want to." She looked at him for a long time, and he let her, because she had the right to look and he had nothing to hide. "You are not a man who asks for things he is not prepared to offer in return," she said finally. "No," he said, "I am not." "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you, Eli Granger." He reached for her hand and she gave it, and the sunflowers stood around them in their hundreds catching the last gold of the day, and he thought that he had never in his life been more precisely where he was supposed to be. They were married in September of 1879, exactly 1 year after the town meeting where Sarah Wells had raised the only dissenting hand in the room. The ceremony was in the Millhaven church, which was not large but was full, because in the year since the charter amendment, Sarah had become something other than the newcomer who had made everyone uncomfortable at the meeting. She had become, in the way of small towns when they finally come around, a fixture, and people said that she had always seemed like a woman of good sense. Clara Dunmore cried throughout the ceremony, which she later attributed to dust, although the day was clear. Eli stood at the front of the church in the suit he had ordered from a tailor in Dodge City and watched Sarah walk toward him in a dress the color of cream, her hair down except for the arrangement of wildflowers that Clara had helped her pin in, and he held himself very still because the alternative was to make some kind of undignified display. When she reached him, she took his hand and held it firmly, and the minister said the words, and they said their own, and it was done. The wedding supper was held in the very same town hall where everything had started, which Eli had suggested and Sarah had found suitable, and which gave the evening a quality of satisfying circularity. Even Fletcher Hamby was there, and he shook Eli's hand and told him in his gruff, grudging way that Sarah seemed like a woman who got things done, which was the nearest to a compliment he was likely to offer. Eli's ranch house, which Sarah had once described as a very determined bachelor's residence, underwent considerable changes in the autumn of 1879. She did not approach it sentimentally or with any interest in imposing her taste unnecessarily, but she had practical opinions about kitchen organization and a few specific additions she wanted: a larger window in the main room and a proper pantry for her preserves, and a section of the yard fenced for a kitchen garden. Eli built all of it without complaint, and in truth he found that the changes made the house feel more real, less like a staging ground for a life, and more like the life itself. They settled into each other's rhythms the way two people do when they are genuinely suited, with occasional friction and considerable warmth, and the kind of humor that a shared life generates between people who are paying attention. Sarah kept her own land in operation, which caused some comment in town since most women of that era did not maintain an independent business after marriage. But Eli had never suggested otherwise, and the comment in town was just that, comment, not anything with teeth in it. The winter of 1879 was milder than the previous one, which felt like a small kindness from the weather. They spent the long evenings reading by the fire, which had been a thing they had each done alone before and now did together, with the comfortable interruptions of sharing a passage or a thought. Eli discovered that Sarah's opinions about novels were as definite as she had suggested, and that she extended the same quality of close attention to a book that she brought to everything else, which made her the best reading companion he had ever had, which admittedly was not a competitive field given that his previous reading companions were a dog and his own silence. In the spring of 1880, Sarah told him she was expecting a child. He was in the kitchen when she told him, washing up after a morning of fence repairs, and he turned around with water dripping from his forearms and looked at her, and she was watching him with that measured expression that he now knew covered a great many things, including in this case a barely contained joy that she was working to keep proportional in case his response required managing. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his wet arms around her, which soaked the shoulders of her dress, and held her for a long moment without saying anything because words felt inadequate. She put her face against his shoulder and let him hold her, and he could feel that she was smiling. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I am very well," she said. "I am also apparently going to need to let out the panels of several dresses which I consider a fair trade." He laughed and held her tighter and thought about his father and about the Ohio farm and about everything that had been pointed toward this and not known it. The pregnancy was not an easy one, though Sarah approached it with the same disciplined practicality she brought to everything. The summer heat on the Kansas plains was punishing in 1880, and she tired more easily than she was comfortable admitting, though he noticed and adjusted accordingly. He took on the heavier work of her land during the worst of the season, and hired a young man from town named Bobby Cates to help with the additional labor, and he made sure she was never without water or shade or whatever she needed, without making a production of providing it, because he understood that she would find excessive solicitude more burdensome than the heat itself. They talked about the child in the evenings, quietly and with a kind of careful anticipation, making decisions about what mattered to them as parents. Sarah had opinions about education that she had been forming for years, having observed that a lack of it closed more doors than most people understood. She wanted their child to read early and read widely and to understand numbers as a practical tool rather than an abstract exercise. "You have already written the curriculum," Eli said one evening in July. "Not written it," she said. "Thought about it. There is a difference." "There frequently is not in your case," he said. She looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "It is not," he said with complete sincerity. The baby arrived in November of 1880, a boy who came into the world with a considerable opinion of the whole enterprise, announcing himself with great volume at 2 in the morning, while the November wind performed its own statement outside. Eli was present throughout, which was not universally the custom but was what Sarah had wanted and what he had never considered not doing, and he held the boy when the doctor finally handed him over, this small person wrapped in a square of flannel, and felt the particular vertigo that apparently accompanies the first time a man holds his own child. They named him Thomas Henry Granger, Thomas for Sarah's father and Henry for Eli's, which seemed right. Thomas was a vigorous and determined child from his first weeks, which Eli had perhaps predicted based on his parentage. He slept in decisive intervals and was alert between them in a way that made both his parents feel watched. Sarah took to motherhood without any of the uncertainty she had been quietly worried about, her care for Thomas as attentive and thoughtful as everything else she did, and with a warmth in it that Eli had seen hints of but not the full measure of until now. She sang to the baby in a low, unself-conscious voice that she would never have used if she thought anyone was listening, and Eli was careful not to let on that he listened every time. The spring of 1881 brought new development to Millhaven. The railroad had been discussing a spur line to the town for 2 years, and the discussions finally produced something concrete in the form of a survey team that arrived in March to assess the route. This was significant for everyone in the area, because rail access meant the difference between a small, isolated settlement and a town with a future. It also meant that land values along the potential rail corridor would shift considerably, which introduced a set of pressures and interests that had not existed before. Eli found himself at the center of negotiations that involved not just the Cattlemen's Association, but the town council and several large landholders who had property near the proposed corridor. There were meetings nearly every week through March and April, and he came home from them with the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from navigating people with competing interests who are not always honest about what those interests are. Sarah listened to his account of each meeting with her full attention, which had become one of the things he relied on most, not just because she was good company, but because her mind was genuinely useful when applied to a problem. She had a way of identifying what the real question was beneath the stated one that cut through a great deal of noise. Fletcher Hanby is not objecting to the rail corridor on its stated grounds, she said one evening in April, after Eli had described yet another meeting where Hanby had raised procedural obstacles. He has property on the eastern edge of the proposed corridor. He is trying to force the survey team to shift the route so that the corridor goes through his land rather than past it, because a rail easement would mean a payment. Eli looked at her. How do you know about his property? Clara Dunmore knows everything about everyone's land holdings, she said serenely. And she talks to me. Eli went back to the next meeting with this information and confirmed it quietly through the county records before raising it, and the subsequent conversation with Hanby was brief and unambiguous. Hanby was not pleased, but the route was confirmed on its original survey, and the negotiations moved forward. You have a gift for finding the buried thing, he told Sarah that evening. I spent a long time having to notice what was not being said, she told him. It becomes a habit. He thought about what that meant, about the years before Millhaven, before him, in which she had had to be vigilant in ways that he, as a man in a world designed for men, had never needed to be. It was one of the injustices of the world as it existed in 1881, and he knew it, and knowing it made him more determined to make sure that his corner of it operated as fairly as possible. The rail spur was approved, and construction began in the summer of 1881. Millhaven would have its connection to the main line by the following spring, and the town buzzed with the anticipation of growth. New families began arriving through the summer and into the fall, attracted by the prospect of a connected market, and the population of Millhaven grew by nearly a third over 8 months. Thomas walked his first steps in September of 1881, which was not remarkable timing, but which felt remarkable to Eli and Sarah in the entirely disproportionate way of parents for whom everything their child does first is enormous. He walked across the kitchen floor from the table to his mother with a look of ferocious concentration, and a gait that was more controlled falling than walking, and when he reached her and she caught him, he looked up at Eli with an expression of absolute triumph that Eli would remember clearly for the rest of his life. The winter of 1881 was mild again, and the spring of 1882 arrived with the rail connection and a Millhaven that was perceptibly larger and noisier, and more complicated than the one Eli had been running cattle near when Sarah first arrived. New businesses opened on Main Street, and a second general store and a proper hotel, and a school building that Clara Dunmore had organized a fundraising campaign for since the previous summer. Sarah was involved in the school campaign from the beginning, which did not surprise Eli. She had strong views about education and was not shy about advocating for them, and her combination of clear argument and organized follow-through made her the effective engine of the committee, even though Clara held the official chairmanship. The school opened in September of 1882 with a teacher from Cincinnati and 16 students, and Sarah stood at the back of the first day's session and watched with an expression that Eli, who had come to watch with Thomas on his hip, recognized as the look she wore when something had come out right after a long effort. He found her hand in the crowd and held it, and she leaned slightly against him for just a moment before standing straight again, which was her version of leaning on someone. Thomas started at the school the following year, when he was old enough, and demonstrated early that he had inherited both of their intellectual stubbornness and neither of their patience, which made for interesting parent-teacher conversations. He was bright and physical and opinionated, and Eli looked at him sometimes with a combination of helpless pride and genuine alarm. In the spring of 1883, Sarah told him there was going to be a second child. She told him in the kitchen again, which seemed to be where the significant things happened between them, and he was not washing up this time. He was having breakfast, and she set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table and said it simply and directly, in the way she did everything. He looked at her over the coffee and felt all the same things he had felt the first time, the vertigo and the warmth, and the sense of being part of something larger than himself, and a few additional things that were harder to name, something about time and continuity and the feeling of a life accumulating substance. "How do you feel?" he said. "Well," she said. "Better than the first time so far. Thomas is going to be insufferable about this," he said. "Thomas is going to be wonderful about it," she said, and then insufferable in that order. She was right on both counts. Thomas, when told that summer that he was going to have a brother or sister, was initially solemn with the importance of it and then, within 48 hours, began conducting a campaign for a brother with a persistence that both of them found impressive and exhausting. The second child arrived in November of 1883, a girl, and Thomas looked at her for a long moment in the particular evaluative way he had, and then announced that she was acceptable, which was high praise from a 3-year-old who had wanted something else. They named her Clara Ann Granger, the first name for the friend who had been quietly and consistently important to both of them throughout the years. Clara Dunmore, the actual one, was at the house the next morning with a basket of food and the precise expression of a woman who has had a town named after her in the metaphorical sense, which is a very specific kind of pleased. Millhaven in 1884 was a different place from the town of the September 1878 meeting, and in many ways a better one. The rail connection had brought prosperity, and the school had brought the next generation of that prosperity, and the charter revisions that Eli had pushed through in 1878 had been expanded twice since then, once in 1880 and once in 1882, creating a water allocation board that included formal representation from both cattle and agricultural interests. It was not a perfect system, but it was a fairer one, and several families who might not have survived without it had survived. Sarah's land had grown from its original parcel. She had bought the adjacent 20 acres in 1881 and brought it into production, and by 1884, she was running a modest but real agricultural operation that sold not just at the local market, but through the rail connection to markets in Dodge City and occasionally beyond. She hired 2 people to help, which she managed with the same combination of clear expectation and genuine fairness that she brought to everything. Eli's cattle operation had grown as well, and he had 2 full-time hands now, young men who worked hard and to whom he paid decent wages, and with whom he was honest about the terms of their employment. He had not forgotten what it was to work for someone else. He was elected to the town council in 1883 on the basis of his work with the water allocation revisions and the rail negotiations, and a general sense in the town that he was someone who took the community's interests seriously rather than just his own. He took the role seriously and spent more time on it than was strictly required, because he thought that things done halfway were not worth doing, and because Sarah's example had, over the years, raised his own standards of civic engagement without her ever once suggesting that they needed raising. She attended the town council meetings regularly, sitting in the gallery and watching with the same clear attention she had brought to the meeting where she had been the only raised hand against him. He was aware of her up there, and had long since stopped finding that awareness distracting, had instead found it organizing, like a compass that keeps its orientation. On a warm evening in May of 1885, they sat on the porch of the ranch house after the children were in bed, the plains stretching out before them in the long last light of a Kansas spring day. Thomas's boots were drying on the porch railing, still muddy from the afternoon, and Clara's small cloth rabbit sat forgotten on the step, and the Cimarron was just audible from here on a quiet night, which this was. Eli had his feet up on the railing, and Sarah was sitting beside him with a book she had set face down on her knee some minutes ago, which meant she was thinking rather than reading. The stars were starting to appear above the darkening eastern sky. "My father would have liked it here," she said. "Tell me something about him I do not know," he said. She thought for a moment. He had a theory that the most important thing you could give a person was the confidence that they were worth listening to, she said. Not just agreeable or convenient, but genuinely worth hearing out. He said most of the world's unhappiness came from people who had never been listened to and had spent their lives either going quiet or going angry about it. He was a wise man, Eli said. He would have said he was a lucky man who had time to think, she said. Not mutually exclusive. No, she agreed. He turned to look at her profile against the darkening sky, something he had done 1,000 times now, and which had not lost anything in the repetition. The line of her nose and her jaw and the way she held her head, level and clear, as though she expected the world to make sense and was prepared to require it to. "Sarah," he said. She turned to look at him, those gray-green eyes now dark in the low light. "That day at the town meeting," he said, "when you raised your hand against me, I have thought about it a great deal over the years." "Have you?" she said with a faint smile. "You were right about everything. The charter, the system, all of it. But what I have thought about most is not the substance, though the substance mattered. It was the fact that you did it at all. Every person in that room expected you to stay quiet, and the room's expectation of your silence was so complete that it almost became a kind of wall, and you just walked through it." She was quiet, listening to him in the way she always listened, fully present. "I had never seen anyone do exactly that," he said. "Not with that quality of, I suppose the word is steadiness. Like you had decided it was the right thing, and the room's opinion of that decision was information but not instruction." He paused. "I respected you before I knew anything else about you." She looked at him for a moment, and he could see the thing in her face that she still sometimes kept carefully covered, the warmth that went very deep and that she had let him see in full only by degrees and over years. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what made it more impressive." She turned back to the plains and was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her thinking about something. "I almost did not come to that meeting," she said. "I had been to 2 previous ones and said nothing both times. I had prepared things to say and then not said them, because the room was arranged in a way that made saying them feel futile. But that night I thought about my father. About what he said about being worth listening to." She paused. "And I thought, even if no one here is going to listen, I am going to say it, because it is the truth and because someone should." "Someone should," he agreed softly. "And then the one person I expected least to listen did," she said. "You changed the way I think about things," he said. "I want you to know that. Not just the charter, not just the association. The whole way I look at a situation, whether I am starting from inside a system or outside it, who has a voice and who does not. You changed that." She turned back to him, and in the near dark her expression was open in the full way that it was only when she was very certain of her ground, which she was here with him after everything. "You were the first person in Millhaven who ever looked at me like my opinion was worth something beyond being managed," she said. "Do you know how rare that was?" "I am sorry it was rare," he said. "I am glad it was you," she said. He reached over and took her hand from her knee, turning it palm up and folding his own around it, which was the gesture that had begun everything and which had become, over the years, one of the fundamental languages between them. The stars were fully out now, the Milky Way beginning to develop in its extravagance above the plains, and somewhere behind them Thomas called out something from inside the house, some half-asleep demand that dissolved before it reached them, and Clara made the small sound she made in her sleep, and the ranch house settled around its people with the particular contentment of a structure that has been well used. The following years in Millhaven were good ones, marked by steady growth and the particular rhythm of a life that has found its proper shape. The town continued to expand, and the school grew from one room to two and then, by 1887, to a proper two-story building that was the pride of the county. Sarah served on the school board from 1885 onward, and the curriculum she had been quietly formulating since before Thomas was born eventually became, in modified form, the approach the school used, which she described to Eli as getting there eventually, which was the story of most worthwhile things. Eli ran for the county commission in 1886 and was elected, which expanded his responsibilities considerably and meant more time in the county seat and more complicated negotiations at a larger scale. He approached it the same way he had approached everything, with directness and a willingness to be persuaded by evidence, and a refusal to make promises he could not keep, which was considered either admirable or unhelpful depending on who was doing the considering. Sarah ran the ranch operation and the farming business during the periods when his commission work took him away, which she managed without fuss and with considerable competence. Bobby Cates, the young man Eli had hired to help with the farming during Sarah's first pregnancy, had grown into a capable ranch hand, and with him and two others, the operation ran well in Eli's absence. Thomas, at 7, was the kind of child who seemed to have been born with a full set of opinions and was simply adding evidence to them over time. He had Eli's stubbornness and Sarah's precision, and a combination of the two was formidable in a person of any age. He had decided he was going to be a rancher, which Eli thought was probably correct given how he took to the animals, but Sarah made sure he understood that whatever he was going to be, he was going to be an educated one. Clara was quieter than her brother, which was not difficult, and more observant, and had a gift for drawing that she exercised on any available surface, including two of the kitchen walls before Sarah redirected her to proper paper. She had her mother's eyes and her father's refusal to be hurried, which made her interesting to watch at work. In the spring of 1887, Sarah's farming operation had expanded to the point where she was considering whether to formalize it further, to move from a market seller to something that operated as a proper supply business. She discussed it with Eli over a series of evenings, working through the numbers and the logistics with the thoroughness she brought to large decisions. "You would need to find storage capacity," he said, going over the figures she had laid out. "The current barn is adequate for your own operation but not for a supply scale." "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about the old Hennessy property on the north edge. The barn is larger than what I need right now, but it would not always be." "You are thinking years ahead." "It is the only way to think about land," she said, which was something her father had told her and which she had found to be consistently true. The Hennessy property became Sarah's in the summer of 1887, and the expansion of her operation proceeded over the following 2 years with her characteristic combination of careful planning and decisive action. By 1889, Wells Produce, as it had come to be known, was supplying 5 establishments in Millhaven and 2 in the next county, with regular shipments going out by rail to the Dodge City market. It was on a warm June evening of 1889, after a particularly full day, that Eli found her sitting on the porch steps with her feet in the cool grass, her boots set neatly beside her. He sat down beside her, and she leaned against him with the ease of 10 years of closeness. "Tired," he said. "Satisfied," she said. "They are different." "They are." Thomas was across the yard, conducting some kind of elaborate operation with the wood stack that involved strategy Eli could not quite follow. Clara was reading on the porch behind them, her feet tucked under her in the chair that had become her particular chair. "I was thinking today," Sarah said, "about September of 1878. "Were you?" he said, putting his arm around her. "I was thinking about how afraid I was and how determined I was, and how completely I expected nothing to change," she said. "How I thought it would simply be a thing I had said that would be noted and dismissed, and that nothing would come of it except that I had said it. And," she turned to look at him, "and everything came of it." He looked at her, this woman with her gray-green eyes and the years of prairie sun now visible in the fine lines at their corners. This woman who had walked into a hostile room and said the right thing because it needed saying, and who had changed the shape of everything he was going to be. "Everything came of it," he agreed. She put her head on his shoulder, and they watched Thomas reorganize the wood stack with tremendous purpose, and Clara turned a page behind them, and the Kansas plains went golden in the late light, and the Cimarron ran cool and clear over its stones toward wherever water goes, and Millhaven sat solid and real in the distance, the school bell still visible on its two-story building, the rail station with its afternoon train already departed. And all of it connected to that night in September, when a woman had raised her hand alone in a room full of hands pointed the other way. Eli thought about what it meant to respect someone before you loved them, and what it did to love when respect was its foundation, and decided that it made the love into something load-bearing, something that could hold the weight of time and difficulty, and the ordinary, extraordinary business of a shared life. There was one more thing he had been meaning to say, and he had been looking for the right moment, which he had learned from 10 years of marriage to Sarah Wells, was the moment you stopped looking for the right moment and simply said it. "I want you to know," he said, "that I would not change a single Saturday morning or a single evening by the fire or a single argument about the water allocation or the school curriculum or whether sunflowers are practical." She laughed against his shoulder, the open, warm laugh he had first heard at the Christmas social and had been collecting ever since. "Not even the argument about sunflowers. Especially that one," he said. "Because you were right, and I was wrong, and I prefer a life in which that can happen, and I know it." She lifted her head and looked at him, and the evening light caught her face, and she was as beautiful to him as anything he had ever seen, not because of the light, though the light was generous, but because of everything she was, all of it visible to him now in the way that only years of genuine attention can make a person visible to another person. "Eli Granger," she said, "I love you." "I know," he said, "and I love you." They sat together on the porch steps of the house he had built, and she had made into something more than a building, in a town that was better for having had both of them in it, in a state that was still becoming whatever it was going to be, in a year that was simply one of many good ones. Thomas eventually gave up on the wood stack and came to sit on the bottom step, leaning against Eli's leg with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has always had a place to lean. Clara set down her book and looked out at the plains with her mother's contemplative expression, and Sarah looked at her daughter and felt the specific tenderness of seeing yourself reflected in someone who is going to go further than you did. "The train brought something new today," Thomas said, to no one in particular. "What did it bring?" Sarah asked. "Mr. Dunmore said there are 2 new families coming. They are going to build on the east side." "More neighbors," Eli said. "More students," Sarah said with quiet satisfaction. Thomas considered this. "I hope they have horses," he said. "They probably have horses," Eli said. Clara turned from the plains. "I hope they have books," she said, in a perfect echo of her mother's priorities, and Sarah pressed her face briefly against Eli's shoulder so that no one would see the expression that crossed it. The night came on in the slow, lavish way that summer nights come on in Kansas, the sky darkening from pale blue to deep violet to the profound black that opened up the stars. The fireflies came out in the grasses near the fence line, and the Cimarron was silver under the rising moon, and the 4 of them stayed on the porch longer than they usually did, because the evening was too good to go inside. Later, after Thomas had been collected from the porch step where he had fallen asleep leaning against his father's leg, and Clara had folded herself into bed with her book tucked under her pillow, and the house was quiet in its deep summer quiet, Eli and Sarah stood in the kitchen in the lamplight, which was where the significant things had always happened between them. "The new families will need to know about the water allocation process," Sarah said, reaching past him for the lamp to take it to the bedroom. "I will tell them," he said, "and they should know they can come to the allocation board meetings. I will tell them that too." She looked at him with the particular look she had when she was about to say something that mattered. "Do you know what I think about sometimes? Tell me." "I think about what would have happened if I had not spoken up at that meeting," she said. "If I had done what I did the 2 meetings before and prepared what I wanted to say and then not said it, I think about all the things that would not have happened." "Don't," he said gently. "I am not lamenting it," she said. "I am marveling at it. That one decision to say a true thing in a room that did not want to hear it pulled everything else into existence. You, the charter, the children, all of it." She paused. "It seems like too much for one moment to carry." "It is exactly the right amount for that moment," he said, "because it was the right moment and you were exactly the right person." She looked at him steadily, and he could see in her face all the years of it, the arrival in Millhaven with nothing but her father's land and her own spine, the market stands in the cold and the water allocation fights, and the children and the sunflowers and the kitchen and the porch and the stars and all the Saturday mornings, all of it in her face at once, and she was more real to him than anything he knew. She took the lamp in one hand and his hand in the other, and they walked together down the hall of the house he had built and she had filled, toward the room where they had talked and argued and laughed and slept through Kansas winters and Kansas summers, and the lamp made their shadows long on the wall, and outside the plains ran away forever in the moonlight, and Millhaven settled into its good summer sleep, and the story of Eli Granger and Sarah Wells, which had begun in a town hall with one raised hand against a room full of others, continued in the best and most ordinary way that love stories continue, which is quietly and together, into the years ahead.